A quick note, welcome to this afternoon session. I'm Don Tebow with the OpenID Foundation, and the HEART Working Group is one of our most prominent work groups. It is taking on the most gnarly of identity systems problems, and I'm delighted that Edith is going to walk us through it.
Well, great. Let me just have a show of hands here. Is there anybody here from the health or healthcare or health IT industry? Great, awesome. Anybody here from the HEART Working Group while I'm asking? Okay, one person, yay. So I'm here to talk about what I think, since I'm a co-chair of it, some really interesting work that's going on at the OpenID Foundation, and I guess I just have to laud Don and the OpenID Foundation for taking on some important work at a timely juncture. So why did we start this working group? About a year and a half ago. Why are we doing this work? So first of all, individuals, human beings, bags of protoplasm, want to gather and control and share their health data. And I say health data, not just healthcare data, because now health data can come from lots of different sources, including places that aren't just overtly things like hospitals and doctor practices. Exactly, yes, indeed. And, you know, we want our autonomy. We want to be able to give permission for access to that data, and we want to be able to change our minds and do what we will. And more, this data is not in analog form. It's in digital form, such as for mobile apps and smart devices, maybe fitness devices, maybe clinical devices, maybe they're MRI machines, maybe they are things that were prescribed to us, maybe they're things implanted in us, maybe they're things worn on our hips, maybe they are things that doctors send us home with. And this is especially so as a health condition might get more complex, or maybe if we're in certain demographics. Now, this digital data tends to get stored in electronic records, EHRs, electronic health records, sometimes maybe increasingly personal health records. There are starting to be regulations, more and more regulations about this. HIPAA is not a new health regulation, it's one of the older ones, but especially relevant. Now, there's a whole bunch of other populations, clinicians, insurers, researchers, and others who want or need, maybe marketers as well, access to this data. And some use cases are to diagnose ailments, to plan care, to pay for care, and in different parts of the world, there's different parties who end up paying for care. And the goal of HEART overall, Health Relationship Trust again, is to put the individual, oftentimes the patient in a patient role, back at the center of that conversation as this world around us is changing. And it's kind of a digital transformation conversation. So what are the goals and what is the scope of this working group? Number one, restful health data sharing. So we've just put ourselves squarely in an electronic digital world. That does limit the scope quite a bit. We're talking primarily about online individuals, or individuals when they're in a position to be online at certain junctures. It's patient-centric, it's privacy-sensitive, it's internationally applicable. Now, there's a lot of folks, I'll be talking about who's at the table in a moment, but there's a lot of folks from the US, but it's not limited to US circumstances. We are primarily profiling existing specifications. We're trying not to duplicate work. We're trying to layer on top of existing work. So that includes standards OAuth, OpenID Connect, and also user-managed access. Let me take a moment to invite you to the session I'll be giving directly after this one with Justin Richer over in Chicago 9. And also a semantic API that's a standard, an emerging standard from HL7, Health Level 7, called FHIR. and that stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And I'm imagining there's a few of you going, yeah, I know FHIR, it's not pronounced FHIR. And that's basically an API and a set of data structures that are, is very RESTful, very modern. You can find, JSON structures for interchange of EHR data, and it's quite often used now for things like smart data coming off of smart devices and ways to control smart devices. So it's a really modern kind of stack that we're profiling. And it's part of the goals to foster interoperable implementations. And here's a couple of non-goals or things that are out of scope. One is not to specify a patient discovery mechanism. And what health IT people would think of this as is patient matching, ensuring you've got the right patient ID, because that is sort of a whole ball of wax, or to use another metaphor, we didn't want to boil that ocean. In my standards work, I like to say, I just want to boil a small pond. That's bad enough. We are also not in charge of specifying any kind of trust framework, so kind of business trust agreements. That definitely would have to be done among those who deploy these profiles. There's lots of work that's been going on in the world. For example, Open Identity Exchange has published a lot of papers and is doing more around trust frameworks, and other .orgs have done a lot of great work. That has to be done in the world. There's a thing called the BLT sandwich, which is business, legal, and technical. Not saying it doesn't have to be done. Our group specifically is not doing that. We're sticking to the technical. Who takes part? Who's at the table? So a couple of key populations. One is health and health IT subject matter experts, and another is technology experts. And in some cases, they overlap. So we have folks from U.S. Health and Human Services Office of the National Coordinator, and from a subset of that, SAMHSA. Actually, my co-chair is Debbie Bucci from HHS ONC. I myself am from Forgerock, so we're a software vendor. So we have people who are MDs at the table, and people who have nursing degrees, and people who are software implementers, and people who are spec writers, and so Justin Richer, with whom I'm giving my UMA talk, he's our spec editor, and he is well-known spec author and implementer and so on. So really broad range, and it's been one of our kind of lessons learned to come together and have common vocabulary. What's the way we've been doing that? Well, it's by first and foremost collecting use cases. So these include things like looking at what one of our number calls the multiple portal challenge. And anybody in the US who's lived through the mandate to have these electronic health record systems with portals, and every doctor you go to and every practice putting in place a different portal system and getting another login. I mean, here we are, all of us identity professionals going, really? Another 10 logins? Knows the challenge. Not just another 10 logins, but another bunch of things that aren't integrated. Virtual patient registration, meaning electronic registration onboarding to a practice or a hospital. The third bullet there talks about an Internet of Things use case. And going down the list, clinical and research purposes is interesting because you're looking at potential secondary use of data collected for a clinical purpose. With primary care physician first appointment, we looked at some basic OAuth flows for how you permission access using basic OAuth to data that you might have for what's called virtual clipboard, some basic kind of demographic data about yourself, not necessarily even health data. And then the last one is kind of the doozy. Alice selectively shares health-related data with physicians and others. So that's one where we get into user-managed access use cases. And UMA has really been key for us, because if you want to be patient-centric, you have to get into the realm of somebody choosing to share in a selective fashion data about themselves, or possibly device functioning. So it's not primarily about the data in that case. You've got devices that may have been up to your discretion to even buy off a shelf somewhere, maybe an Apple store or something like that. And your goal is to choose to give access to a doctor, a caregiver, a spouse, something like that, and you want to make it available, and you might want to make it not available in the future. So that's been a key flow that we've actually worked out messaging flows for in detail, and that's inspired our specification work. So let me now talk about what we have delivered, and we have interim deliverables that are currently in implementer's draft status. So that's a formal status that OpenID Foundation dictates. And that implementer's draft stage will end July 18th, I believe. And so we've got specs that are related to OAuth specifically, and OpenID Connect specifically, and UMA specifically. And we have two categories. We think of them as the security profiles, or sometimes we call them the mechanical profiles, and the semantic profiles. And so let me lay those out for you and then describe what those two categories mean. So we have the heart profile for OAuth, OAuth 2. We have the heart profile for OpenID Connect. And we have the heart profile for UMA. Now, what's that little carve out there for? Well, who here is familiar with OAuth? We have a bunch of smarty pants, everybody knows what. Okay. OAuth can protect any API, right? Well, OpenID Connect is it's sort of OAuth protecting a specialty endpoint, if you'll go with me on this journey. It's kind of protecting a user info endpoint plus little bits and bobs. So it kind of comes with its own API. It's an identity or single sign-on API that's OAuth protected. So that's the carve-out there, is like it already had its own API, whereas the heart profile for OAuth has to, it needs to prepare for protecting the FHIR API. And what the security profiles are actually doing is generic security considerations, things like time to live strategy for tokens, and turning down all of the security considerations when it comes to FHIR, but nothing else. And similarly, the heart profile for UMA is just the security considerations, time to live strategy for tokens, and how you manage client credentials and things like that. And as you can see from this building on top of each other, it's all just leveraging whatever we wrote in the gray one at the bottom. Each one on top builds on the bottom one, so they get progressively shorter as you go up. Then we got the semantic profiles, the heart profile for OAuth and FHIR, and the heart profile for UMA and FHIR. Well, what do we mean by a semantic profile? Well, now it comes to the FHIR API is what it is. Well, we can't change it, and we don't really want to change it necessarily, but we're taking into consideration the fact that FHIR has its own data structures and its own way of managing endpoints, essentially, how you call the FHIR API. We're working with that, and we, the Heart group, is in charge of designing scopes for protecting the FHIR API. We're it. There were some informal scopes designed previously, and through our liaison relationships, we're the ones for saying, here's how you OAuth protect FHIR. And that gets into the semantics of the FHIR API. So now we're cooking with gas. So that's our 5 deliverables. And the reason why OpenID Connect has that carve out is because it's really about doing identity and identity alone for this milieu. Now, a couple of specifics. What about confidentiality and sensitivity and break the glass use cases? So I have an example here. Hopefully you can read it. This is about heroin abuse treatment admissions. Now, this is in aggregate, but if this were about a specific person, that would be sensitive data. And that kind of data has to be treated specially according to laws pretty much everywhere. And depending on how old you are, every jurisdiction treats that kind of information specially. And you're required to treat it specially if you have it. And if you were, say, unconscious at the site of some kind of terrible accident, you might not be able to permission access by an emergency responder to your data. That's usually considered a break the glass scenario. What do you do about that? Well, those have special requirements. And in fact, there's special codes in the management of that kind of data. So for those requirements, we actually specified a kind of a scope mechanism that we thought of as cross-cutting. You won't see that phrase in our specs. These are the semantic profiles. So for example, there is a scope that you'll find in the HL7 specs called sense/ETH, which very memorably translates to substance abuse. I don't know why it's ETH. So we defined a scope linking back to HL7 called substance abuse, or that means substance abuse. It's available in both the OAuth and UMA semantic profiles. And here's what it means. If a resource server is capable of filtering out or redacting substance abuse information that has the scope available to it, then it has to advertise this fact that it's capable of doing this. And if a client brings it an access token that does not have the scope, so the scope exists, but the token doesn't have the scope in it, then that's a signal to redact the information. Got it? And a bit similarly, not exactly similarly, but Break the Glass has a scope mechanism where we defined a BTG scope, meaning break the glass, available both at the OAuth level and the UMA level. So how the scope gets issued is out of scope, meaning there may be some user interface where it makes it easier for, maybe there's a default scope that's offered, like in the case of UMA, this is really relevant because people have a choice about whether to, say that they want to give somebody the scope or something like that. So that's particularly relevant user experience options. But in this case, Break the Glass has the consequence that the resource server has to log any Break the Glass access given. Because, hey, that's kind of like you'd want to know that after the fact because you weren't kind of mentally around. Last thing I want to share with you is that there have been a number of challenges put out called Move Health Data Forward by Health and Human Services Office of the National Coordinator starting in mid-2016, about a year ago. And there's been 3 phases of this where they've basically offered cash awards, for those out in industry providing kind of sample solutions meeting the requirements around API solutions to help individuals authorize the movement of their health data. So this very patient-centric, privacy-sensitive arrangement. And so there have been 3 phases, and there have been several winners. And some of them have actually been directly based on the HART profiles. I mean, some of the profiles were released late last year, and then we've sort of finished the suite of 5 more recently and had them all out in implementer's draft status, as I said. So that's really a kind of a nutshell summary of where we are with the HART work. We're really excited to have gotten to this point. It's starting to become mature. And with that, I'll ask you for your questions and invite you to join us in our work and even the implementation and feedback work. Any questions or comments?
Eve, one thing that may be useful is to talk about how HART might share some resources from the iGov work group.
Yeah, indeed. So there are other OpenID Foundation groups that are doing some similar kind of vertical industry or maybe kind of horizontal industry profiling efforts. So iGov is for government. The financial API work group obviously has a financial bent and is doing this similar effort. And we've been looking at each other's specs to learn from each other. Go ahead, Bjorn.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about how does the UMA HART profile work in conjunction with some of the changes that UMA 2.0 has made?
Good question. So currently the 2 UMA profiles that have been written for HART are against UMA 1.0.1, I mean 1.0.x. They wouldn't have to differ. The talk I'm about to run to in 5 minutes is about UMA 2.0, which is in a pretty mature draft, is in draft recommendation status. Not much would have to change, actually, to put it onto an UMA 2.0. The group hasn't been very explicit about this, but I think we're basically waiting for the ratification of the UMA 2.0 recommendations, which on the happy path would probably happen about mid-August, so pretty soon. But you know, I've obviously had a big hand in shaping the heart profiles, and my assessment is they wouldn't have to change very much, actually.
So before you run away, there's been some.
I'm not running away yet.
I know. There've been several seminars about the healthcare industry.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you very well because a fan just started.
It goes forward. There've been a couple of seminars about healthcare industry and consent management, and majority of them talks about implementation on SAML. What will be your recommendation to, like, the healthcare industry about adopting the heart profile as a approach to leveraging the SAML?
Yeah, you know, I was the first chair of the SAML group. I love SAML. Nothing wrong with SAML, but I do find that FHIR in particular has been one of the things that has helped accelerate the pace of health IT in some fashions. You know, it's not the most fast-moving of industries. Can I say that? But one of the things we've seen with the advent of FHIR is you could actually get moving some experience with hackathons and things like that. And, you know, FHIR servers sort of erupting, and you could start to get some interchange going, at least on an experimental basis. Now, business models are another matter, and in particular in the US, that's a sensitive topic, I would say. But health information exchanges and such have actually, not necessarily on a FHIR basis, but still on a CDA basis, have gotten a lot of health data exchange going in their somewhat limited realms over the last few years. The pressure, though, is on, I think, from a business perspective with things like accountable care, and IoT is a big pressure cooker as well. And so I think, you know, I like to say the IoT economy exists because of the API economy, in large part, since about 2014. And so I think all of those are drivers and accelerators for this kind of technology stack. And security and privacy are big needs that are more recognized in the IoT economy, or at least have been acceleratedly recognized in the IoT economy. And I think those are drivers as well. I think last question, if there is one. If not, I will thank you very much for your time and invite you to, you know, get involved and take a look at the specs.